Hello, my name is Jeff Rolka. I want to thank you for checking out my video. This is the brand newest, although it's the second installment, segment here on the channel. Questions from comments, where in my sort of looking through all the various comments and things that folks write into asking questions about this, that, and the other thing, every once in a while I find something rather intriguing, and so I decide to address it here in video format, and that is exactly what I'm going to do. I'm not going to dilly-dally. Thank you if you've chosen to subscribe. If you haven't yet, I hope that you'll do so now. There are a variety of ways that you can support this channel, and those you'll find in the description, several of which cost you absolutely nothing. Sharing is one of them. Additionally, there are Amazon affiliate links that won't change your shopping experience at all, but certainly help the channel. Right, let's read the question. I'm going to read the question in its entirety, and then I'm going to take it in bits to kind of make sure that we go into appropriate depth as required. Hello. A few questions for you to look at, and perhaps some will be of general interest. 1. Does it matter what time of day you work on your singing? 2. Should your voice sound musical while doing the exercises? Tony Bennett reportedly won't let anyone hear him warm up before a show. 3. Do you recommend using a variety of exercises for the same goal, such as building range or working on vowel alignment or the passaggio, or finding something you do well with and sticking with it? 4. As a musician in the business, do you have any ideas on the difference in analog versus digital recordings? I like classic big voices, and the voices are clearer with ping in digital, but warmer and fuller in analog. For example, Mario Lanza's later recordings show a better voice in the digital and closer to what he must have sounded like, I think. I too am a Richard Miller fan, but then most tenors should be. Thank you again for your work, following you since 2015 or so, and still impressed. So from the bottom line up, thank you. I appreciate that you've been watching all this time and presumably singing along with the exercises. It means a lot, and I really appreciate it. Just this question feels incredibly indulgent to me because there's so many things in it that I want to talk about and delineate. So I'm going to go back to the first question and read that again, and then we'll talk about it. Does it matter what time of day you work on your singing? Yes and no. It may be that in your individual experience you get better results at one time of day versus another time of day. If that's the case, then I think that it's probably advantageous to choose the time of day where you feel that you are using your instrument to its fullest extent, with the caveat that sometimes you have to sing at the time of day that you don't necessarily do your best at. For many vocalists, this is frequently first thing in the morning, and the blunt force advice is to just get up that much earlier. So if you have an 8 a.m. studio session and you normally wake up at 7:30, but your voice isn't really raring to go until like 11 a.m., well, from 7:30 to 11 a.m., I had to do the math really quickly in my head, 3.5 hours. 8 to 9, 9 to 10, 10 to 11, plus a half, 3.5 hours. So if you've got to sing at 8:30 in the morning for some reason, then back that up 3.5 hours and wake up and do your kind of morning routine. That may not be particularly palatable. However, if this is simply an exception to your normal schedule, then it'll be one day where it's a little bit rough, and then you can get on with things. It's worth noting, make sure you get to bed suitably early to get the appropriate amount of sleep. Oftentimes with the morning voice thing, it's about how much true sleep and rest we have been able to have before we've had to wake up. And lack of sleep or lack of rest is one of those insidious things with singing where it seems like it shouldn't really make a difference, or maybe it's just me. Like, I feel like it shouldn't make a difference if I sleep 5 hours or 8, but it does. And that can certainly accumulate and wear you down over time. Now, if you're really not a morning person and you really have to do some critical singing early in the day, then you might have to start that process several days in advance to really be ready for the morning when action is required. Now let's briefly consider the converse here, where you are tasked with singing rather late at night. The example that comes immediately to my mind would be being the quote-unquote headlining act on a club date. Headlining act around the San Francisco Bay Area is the last position, and they sell it as the headlining act, but 9 times out of 10, when you get on the stage, the place is emptied out and you're playing to a mostly empty room from midnight to 1 a.m. in the morning. And the real headlining slot was third, and those were usually given to the NTA's National Touring Act. Now this was before Clear Channel and a lot of other things got involved, and the venues around here started to close down. And it was conceivable that you could get on stage after an act that was legitimately on a tour of the nation. And I've watched it happen where, unfortunately, my band was going on the 4th slot, and, it was a packed house, and then it wasn't. Now, we still got to play to some fans, and that was great. But I digress. That's not always the best time of day to sing either, particularly if you're in a noisy club and you've been talking a lot and you have a beer or two maybe. All of those things can really detrimentally impact your singing voice. Again, individual differences matter. If you're a night owl and a glass of beer or wine doesn't bother your voice, then fine. That's fine, but know thyself, know thy instrument, and plan ahead. And particularly if it's a very critical performance engagement, be it gig or recording, or whatever it happens to be, your best asset is the ability to plan ahead, plan accordingly, and try to put as many sort of balls in your court, if you will, so that you give your best effort. Yes, this requires planning. Yes, this requires forethought. No, it won't help you out if it's Tuesday and you've got to sing at 6 a.m. on Wednesday, probably, unless you're already a morning person. Like some of us here, I'm generally up by 5 most days, and I'm out the door shortly thereafter. So know thyself, plan ahead. In general, though, I think find the time that you are most effective with your practice and leverage that, because that's just going to make you better and better and better. And the more solid your technique becomes, the less those early singing slots or those late slots will matter, because your technique will be habitual and really up to getting your best performance out there. Okay. 2, should your voice sound musical while doing the exercises? Tony Bennett reportedly won't let anyone hear him warm up before a show. I think there's such beautiful questions. Okay, first of all, some singing exercises are not particularly pretty. You can really clearly hear the differences between my cricothyroid dominant singing voice, head voice, and my thyroarytenoid dominant singing voice in that exercise. That is because that exercise is about making sure that I'm accessing and transitioning reliably. It's not really about maintaining resonances or things like that. It's about knowing that I'm using the apparatus in that capacity. This exercise isn't pleasant at all either. That's the NG exercise. It's very useful in working on and cultivating both mask resonance or just learning about how the resonant cavities are working and how to sort of adjust the flow of air and the vocal fold adduction such that you get the kind of blending that you're looking for. Not a pleasant exercise to listen to. That exercise is one of the hardest ones that it's not technically difficult to make the noise, but I think vocalists who are new to that exercise find it so unnervingly unmusical that they think it must be wrong when it sounds so nasty. And it sounds even nastier internally because it's all that like nasal pharynx resonance and sinus resonance, and there's nothing coming out your mouth. And it sort of feels kind of weird, but it's incredibly useful at balancing resonance and balancing adduction. So do I necessarily want to have other people hear me sing that? Not really, but I also kind of don't care because I'm working on my voice, and to me, that's more important. If I were Tony Bennett, I probably wouldn't want people to hear me warm up either, because Tony Bennett is put on an almost untouchable pedestal in terms of the crooners. It would be incredibly nerve-wracking to be Tony Bennett. And anyone who ever heard him sound anything at all but like the Tony Bennett you expect to hear on a recording, if they recorded it, it would be really, really difficult to be in his shoes. You know, walk a mile in those shoes, and consider the history and the reputation that he has as a vocalist. I wouldn't want people to hear me warm up either. But me, personally, no. I don't mind at all. But what was the gist of this question again? Should your voice sound musical? Yes, I think it should, is the simplest answer to that question. The vowel sounds in these vocalizations, they translate into the songs in the repertoire that we are singing. So in that example too, I'm making a slight diminuendo as I descend and a slight crescendo as I ascend. That tracks along with typical performance practices for singing songs. As we ascend a phrase, generally speaking, it's desirable to have a little bit of a crescendo, get a little louder. As we descend, we want to get a little softer. Consequently, that's actually not a good choice of words. Conveniently, that's the word I was looking for. Conveniently, this works really well with good vocal function. As we ascend and we're really committing to our expansion and we're increasing the subglottic air pressure, it is quite natural in a released system to get a little bit more resonance and get a bit more volume. That would be a place where I could put consequently get a little bit more volume. So I think that they should be musical. Once you've mastered the cardinal vowels in your vocalizations and you're freely going all across your registration events, then you can start working on different affectations and things like that before you have that mastered. But I think it's advantageous to really get a concrete sense of vowel alignment and registration event practice before you start to add too many affectations in the consideration of style. So right now, for example, it's very, very of the moment to have a lot of air in the voice. Let a little bit of air seep over the vocal fold and kind of soften it up a little bit and give it a little bit of that kind of a quality, right? That's done a lot. But if you always practice that way, it can be difficult or impossible to have the vocal fold adduct in a truly efficient capacity when you want it. That's important because you might be clipping along here. And then all of a sudden, the big crescendo to the chorus happens. Where you really want the vocal fold to adduct properly. And you might not get the response that you want if you've only done the vocalizations with that breathy sound. So the adducted vocal fold is neutral. That's the neutral tone quality. And then breathiness, or maybe belting and going a little harder, or things like that, or having a more increased amount of mask resonance, or bringing that back slightly. All of those things are the manipulations of neutral that we do ultimately to create our style and our musicality. They are the seasonings to our sounds that, not that we weren't unique to begin with, that really truly take us into that quality of making our own artistic expression in the musical domain. But I do think that your standard vocalizations, we should endeavor to be musical. Yes. I'm thinking specifically of a conductor whom I sat under for on and off over the course of several years. And it's been too long for me to quote him directly, so I won't. But he always insisted that warming up and tuning and all of those things be done in as musical and artistic fashion, because he felt that it translated into our musicianship in general. And I think that I agree with that assessment of things. 3, do you recommend using a variety of exercises for the same goal, such as building range or working on vowel alignment or the passaggio, or finding something you do well with and sticking with it? Brilliant. Brilliant question. Insightful. Yes, at a certain stage. In the beginning, when we are first learning the principles of vowel alignment, if you were taking lessons with me, what you would observe would be we'd work together to find which vowels were really close to being balanced in phonation, and then we would take that vowel or that group of vowels and use them as leverage over the other cardinal vowels until we had alignment. Very, very common example here is like your ah vowel. So for example, let's say my ah vowel does not align. Way out of alignment there on ah. But E and A, O, those are all reasonably in alignment with one another. We would take that ah vowel and we would figure out which sequence of vowels got you the best results. Often, it's something to this effect. When the vocalist in question can start their phrase with an aligned A vowel, that is a sequence that I will typically reach for to make sure that the ah vowel stays in that same kind of vocal formation. We use A to begin the phrase with because it's very similar to how we phonate ah, and E at the end to bring the narrowness of the thyroarytenoid dominant singing voice back into play. So we're going to use those vowels against one another. Not against, we're going to use them for. We're working together here. E, A, ah, they're all friends on the forward-focusing side of the vowel spectrum anyway. They just don't necessarily always get along. Here we will teach them to get along. We'll learn them to get along. Now, once you've got your vowels in alignment, or I should say, when your vowels are starting to get reliably into alignment, it's then time to start challenging the sequence and challenging where you start with a tonal onset and rotating through the different sequences. Switching it up, going backwards, going forwards, putting them into different combinations. This is part of the reason why there's so many different warm-ups on my channel, because we need to have these vowels shift around into different combinations, into different orders, within reason. We don't have to go too crazy, because that we'll generally find in our repertoire. Ultimately, once the vowels are in alignment, take the vowels from your songs. You can even take the melodies from those songs and turn them into vocalizations for you to practice. So, depending on where you are in the process, it might be beneficial to have vocalizations that are all really, really similar. And you'll find this in the beginner playlist on my channel. I adhere to the E, A, A, O, U order of cardinal vowels, I think almost entirely on all those videos. On the warm-up channel in general, you get different combinations where I'm doing different things. The idea there is that if you have observed one vowel being out of alignment from some other, you can then find the video and address it and work through that process so that you've got good vowel alignment. The biggest concern that I had when I read that question was thinking about the vocalist who has got one combination across the secondo passaggio. So you'll get someone, using myself here as an example, so my secondo passaggio is here in this F, F sharp area, and I'm singing, and I've got it dialed in. No problem, like I'm happy. But do any other combination of vowels, can't do E, can't do U. That's problematic because those vowels are probably at some point going to show up in a word that's above your secondo passaggio. So we have to mix it up. We have to use different vocalizations so that we don't just get what works. We have to challenge ourselves, know what works, use it as leverage to help us figure out what we are challenged by. I think I've addressed that question. Let me know in the comments if there's something more that I missed there. I'm second guessing myself. 4. As a musician in the business, do you have any ideas on the difference in analog versus digital recordings? So this could be a video. I'm sure there are dozens and dozens of videos that discuss this. I could go on for dozens and dozens of videos, probably, because the pro audio domain isn't just analog versus digital. It's everything on the front end of that and everything on the back end of it too that is going to have a lot of impact on the final results that you get. Now, I have recorded I've recorded in both domains. However, I've never actually, to my knowledge, that's not true. I have mixed in an incredibly rudimentary way in the analog domain, but I wouldn't consider that really a professional kind of recording. The professional recordings that I've done, I have recorded with an analog front end, and also I've recorded with a digital front end. However, all of my recordings have been edited, mixed, and mastered in the digital domain. Now, the short answer to this question is, and I think it was Peter Gabriel who insisted on doing his basic tracking to analog, to tape, still today. And he claimed that by tracking to tape, you came in with that kind of tape warmth and tape compression if you're aligning the deck to utilize that. And so you have that much more warmth to lose when you go into the digital domain. Now, the truth of the matter is that you just get different bumps. So you get a different frequency bump in the analog world, and you get a different frequency bump in the digital world. Tape compression is its own separate thing, and I hope that light running out of batteries isn't too distracting, because I'm going to keep on going. The analog world has a certain, it's typically characterized as having a certain warmth. It's really this frequency response in the lower mid-range that is rather prominent in those recordings, and it has the effect of sounding very smooth and lush and full. And tape compression has a certain kind of squashing of the sound, which is particularly lovely on really loud guitars and drums. So if you're in a rock band, leveraging a bit of that tape compression can be very, very advantageous if you're doing especially like a classic rock, because that's how it was all recorded in the first place. That is something to consider too. If you're in a classic rock cover band, it might behoove you to do the front end of your recordings in analog, because that's how all that stuff sounds. So it's not just that it's lush, it's also that everything was recorded that way at that time. And so your recordings, though new, will sound more like that than if you only did them in the digital domain. The digital domain, certainly, you can't argue with the ease, convenience, and immediacy of it, not even to mention like the recallability of your mixes. So speaking as someone who has struggled to align a 24-track 2-inch reel-to-reel tape deck, that takes time, especially it takes me time, because I'm not particularly good at it. But in the digital world, assuming your system is up and running, which is perhaps a big assumption sometimes, but nowadays they're pretty plug and play, you're ready to rock and roll, and you're going to get really, really good, clear results. For that reason alone, I would argue that the benefits and ease and availability of digital make it worth its while, and with creative choice of microphone and preamplification, you might get conservatively 60%, 70% of the way there in terms of that lushness of analog sound. Specifically, I'm thinking of ribbon microphones. They're expensive, some of them are delicate, and some of them, if now, like new ones, you won't destroy them if you accidentally turn your phantom power on, but old ones you could. So you have to be really, really careful in the handling of them. But many of those crooners were using ribbon microphones, and that has a certain lushness to the sound that definitely carries into the digital world. With careful selection of a ribbon microphone and careful selection of a preamplifier that complements that mic, you can get a very, very crisp but lush sound that works and has the benefits of digital, no tape expenses, no aligning the deck, none of that stuff, recallable mixes, but still has a lot of that lush quality, that warmth that you get from those, shall we say, vintage looking items. Contemporary ribbon mics are fairly robust, and you don't have to worry about them as much as vintage ones, but they're kind of hearkening back to what was being produced some time ago, and they have that sound. to my ear, they sometimes aren't as crisp as I'd like. And so I haven't gone so far as to use one on vocals, but I love them on an acoustic guitar with a multiple microphone setup. You can get really, really nice sounds. The downside to room mics and preamps is expense. Those things can run up your studio costs quite quickly. But if this is going to be your primary recording signal chain, my advice would be to wait until you can get the chain that is best going to suit your needs, and then do that rather than settling for second best or something that isn't quite right, or any number of other parameters that mean you're going to end up spending more money a year down the road when you want to get the gear that you really need and is going to suit your artistic disposition. But as I mentioned, though, I think that the conversation between analog and digital is still ongoing. There's been a resurgence in the production and acquisition of analog tape because the company Quantigy, I believe, went bankrupt, but then it was bought by another company, and so they restarted production, so it's become available again, which is fantastic. I myself wouldn't mind finding a serviceable reel-to-reel 4-track. It's just that they're really hard to find in a good condition, a good enough condition, where it wouldn't be prohibitively expensive to have it repaired to then use for some of the recordings that I do. Because I must admit, I like the sound of analog tape. I liked using it on my first album. It was enjoyable. I like working on tape because you have to make choices much earlier on in the process, and that means less time editing and less time mixing. I'm not a huge fan of all the editing and all that, and I know that it's important, and I do it, but I want to make my choices early based on performances and just getting as close to the artistic idea that I'm trying to convey as I possibly can in as complete a performance as I can do. So right from the get-go, on a reel-to-reel tape, I actually don't know about the 4-track, but on, let's just say, a 24-track 2-inch MCI machine running at 30 IPS, because we did not have Dolby, so we had to run at 30 IPS, inches per second. For a 4.5-minute song, you could only fit 3 of them on the 2,500-foot reel of tape. So right from the very beginning, if you were recording a 5-song EP and you only had 2 reels of tape, that means that you could only record 1 song, the basic tracks for it, twice. Everything else you'd have to make choices about which was your keep or take. So you could roll the tape, do 3 consecutive takes, but then only keep 1. Now, true, yes, you could dump all that into the digital domain, wipe the tape, and then start again. But all of that takes time. It takes time, and time in the studio takes money. And maintaining analog gear takes money too, so that's another argument for the digital world. But if you can find serviceable analog, it's nice to have. I love listening to old analog recordings because I like listening to the affectations, but I don't shy away. I don't really even think about it all that much these days. I mostly just think about it as music, and I'm listening to it. And so much of what I listen to is either really, really old or it's really, really new. And the really, really new stuff a lot of times is recorded in people's bedrooms, and the really, really old stuff was recorded to 2-track stereo in a concert hall someplace, oftentimes in France. I listen to a lot of like Debussy and Satie. So yeah, that would have certainly been analog, because it's old music, a lot of it. And I think that covers it. And yes, Richard Miller, I should mention training tenor voices or any of his texts. Richard Miller is, he's gone, he's died some time ago. Opera singer, teacher. His method books I find, I don't know that I call them method books, they're more like technical training manuals for singers. So much good information in there about appoggio, vowels, some exercises for breathing, you name it. Training tenor voices, excellent book for any tenor out there. Securing baritone, and bass voices, also excellent text. Training soprano voices, excellent. All of it really, really good. The structure of singing, this is sort of omnibus overview of his technical take on things. If you had to choose only one, that's probably the one I would suggest. And conveniently enough, you can oftentimes those used from libraries. Like libraries will be selling off their old books, and that's how I got mine, because all of his stuff, as far as I'm aware, maybe not the baritone book, but a lot of it's out of print, and so it's exorbitantly expensive. That being said, well worth having if you can manage it at some point. So thank you very, very much for this amazing question. If there are follow-ups, please post them in the comments or on Twitter. I've been checking Twitter a little less than usual these days, but I still do pop in quite as much as I possibly can. Thank you so much for the question. Thank you for watching. My name's Jeff. Take really good care of your voices, enjoy singing, and hopefully we'll see you again. Bye. Hello again. After I finished shooting my answer to that question, I started to think more about the digital versus analog thing, and I realized that I think I missed the point. And the point was in listening to these mediums, not necessarily producing work or recording in those mediums. And I must admit, the first thing that crossed my mind when I thought through this again was that I just don't really give it much consideration. I listen to old recordings and new recordings alike, and I might note the difference in sound quality, but it doesn't really strike me to think about it in the terms that were put into the question. But I would say this: digital editing is a step well beyond what you can typically do in the analog tape editing domain. And sometimes when I listen to analog recordings, particularly really, really old ones, I know with a pretty good degree of certainty that even though they would have done multiple takes, that what I'm in fact listening to is a captured performance, as opposed to something that was edited and cobbled together in post-production and is put forward as the performance when it's really more an assemblage of different things. Now, true, you can do an awful lot with slicing tape and with doing overdubs and things like that while you're still in the production phase of an analog project. But once you move beyond that, those options start to diminish rather rapidly when you're only in the analog domain. When you take that analog domain and move it into the digital world, that's a different story still. But case in point, after I thought about it a bit, it occurred to me that I might have missed the point. And so I don't really obsess over whether or not the recording was done in the analog world or the digital world. It's something that might cross my mind. In terms of the qualities of the vocalist, I don't really rely on any recording to definitively define what a vocalist might sound like. I'm fond of saying that once a microphone is involved, all bets are off, because even the considerations that you mentioned with analog versus digital, microphones have frequency response patterns. Equalization can happen that will either emphasize or de-emphasize particular aspects of their vocal sound. The mixing console or preamplification that they went through, and on and on and on. When a microphone is involved, analog or digital, you're still quite a bit I think, removed from the genuine article, from being in the room with that individual. And we're not even talking still about like volume differences when compression, digital, tape, or otherwise, is involved in the process. That too is going to attenuate some louds and also bring the floor up. So their softer vocal deliveries might be louder than what you would experience were you to stand next to them. They would be perceived as louder in the recording. So to think that critically, to worry about analog versus digital, I don't worry about it. I listen more for the performance and what I might glean from it musically. And then knowing the technical profile of my own voice and how I am working in my studio when I'm practicing things and doing stuff like that, I consider all that. And if anything, there's a bit of cognitive dissonance when you hear like a wispy, airy kind of vocal delivery that's just as loud as the rest of the band. Well, that doesn't work like that. Like, you have to be in the studio environment or have amplification, because that abducted vocal fold, what's leaking that much air, is a softer sound, even than if you had an adducted vocal fold. So if you've watched this far, I tip my hat to you because I appreciate it. And I know that I'm well deep into the weeds, and this was a long answer to a question that was posted in the comments section. But thank you, I appreciate it, and I hope that answers your question.